Hi, everyone. Thanks, everybody, for joining. We're having our last people joining us for this session. My name is Noah, and I'm an Israeli emissary to the Greater Washington Jewish Federation. That means that I lead a group of shlichim that some of you maybe know, and we're working on creating a stronger bond between the community in Israel, of Israel, and here with the local Jewish community. And for today's session, I'll be moderating a conversation with Udi Nir, who will share more about himself and obviously Golda, which is our main reason for us meeting today. We would love for as many as you to interact with us in this session through the chat box or on other platforms you're on, or obviously through the Q&A feature here on the screen to the right. You should be able to see that. I definitely have so much question after really watching this really masterpiece, Golda. So I have literally a list of questions, but we will be really happy if first you wanna write your name in the chat or in the Q&A and also add questions of your own. I will let Udi Nir introduce himself and maybe a couple of words, whatever you'd like to say, and we can go with the flow.
Hi everyone, lovely to be here. My name is Udi Nir. I live in Haifa, Israel. That's what we were chatting about in Hebrew for a moment. Golda is my second documentary film. Now the third just came out 2 days ago and the fourth one coming in 2 months. So it's been a hectic year. And I'm very happy to be here today and discuss Golda with you.
Okay, thank you so much. Once again, feel free to add any questions or comments. So until we have some other questions from the audience, the first question that kind of I would like to raise and ask you, Udi, is without disclosing any personal information, but I believe you were born after even Golda was a prime minister. And I think the choice of a young promising creator to work with history materials and some archive materials is not the obvious choice. So I have to ask, what was kind of the motivation? What made you, first of all, deep dive into this topic, and also maybe any motivation or anything in the background?
Absolutely. I personally have to say I really like working. It's a tendency of mine, I would say, to work with found footage or archive materials. But Golda was an exception even to that. If anybody would have told me 4 or 5 years ago that I would be sitting here today talking about a film I made about Golda, I would tell them they're verrückt. But she's definitely not a character that I would say I grew up with or had any kind of fascination with. For me, and I think for most young Israelis, Golda is this kind of old-fashioned, rigid lady who we don't know much about, but has a very negative reputation. I can say that we were 3 directors in the project, me, my partner Sagi Bornstein, and Shani Rosanes, who teamed up with us for this film. And all 3 of us, I think, had fathers or parents who were in the military in the time of the 1973 war, and that really left an impression on everybody who lived through that time, especially those who were serving in the military at the time. And I think most of what we all knew about Golda was that kind of image, the one to blame for the big tragedy of 1973. And that was the extent of my knowledge of her, basically. And this project came about in a pretty unusual way. Almost 4 years ago, we got a call from our partners in Germany who knew us from a previous project. And they asked us, they commissioned us to make a biographical film about Golda Meir. And our initial response was, why? Why now, after so many years? Why 3 relatively young directors who did not live through the time? And how come Germans today even have any kind of interest in how did Golda pop to mind all of a sudden? And I think a few things became clear pretty early on. The first, I would say, is that we realized just after they asked us that this was in 2016. It was the height of the presidential race in the United States. Hillary Clinton was running, and I think there was some kind of fascination with how come 40 years ago in a young state in the Middle East there was a female prime minister. And we all know how that race played out at the end, but I think that it was a hot topic at the time. And so that was one thing that really caught our attention in terms of why this kind of film is relevant in these times. But the two main things, I think, was one was how incredibly different Golda's image is here in Israel and elsewhere around the world, especially, of course, in the United States, and even more especially with American Jewry. I think she has a kind of, almost like an icon status around the world, and especially in the United States. She's a feminist icon, although she herself did not declare herself to be a feminist, quite the opposite, but she became a feminist icon because of her position. And of course, one of the most familiar faces of Zionism, and regarded as the mother of the nation. If Ben Gurion was the father, then she was the mother. And what we knew in Israel, and that was new to us, that was new information to us when we started to research about Golda to see if we want to make this film. And when we realized that there's such a huge difference, that elsewhere in the world, she's such an icon and she has a very positive legacy, but where she acted for most of her life and where she served all of her political career in her homeland, in the homeland that she established, she is regarded in such a negative way. We figured that there must be, it's an interesting tension to start a film from, and we figured that there must be some things that Israelis are missing about her story that people elsewhere were better in catching, and there must be things that people in America or elsewhere have missed about her story, not living through that time here. And the second thing that really drew us in was when one of the first things that we did was, because we didn't know the time and because we were all born way after that, we took a big book of the newspaper covers of these years. It was clear to us that if we make a film about Golda, it will be about her primary, about the fact that she was the time that she was prime minister. That's really what defined her in the historical narrative. And we took the book of the newspaper covers for these years and started to scroll through the pages, and it was incredible to see how unbelievably tense and dramatic these years were. Basically, every conflict that defines our lives in this place, and a lot of big geopolitical questions that still influence the world. All of these issues have were either born at this time or sort of culminated in a remarkable way during those years. And to name a few, we're talking about 2 regional wars, immense internal tensions between different sections of Israeli society, Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Jews, poor and rich, and so on. And the 1972 Munich attacks. Of course, the first days after Israel conquered the West Bank, and the first days of the Israeli occupation, and really huge questions of the Middle East and of this place that sort of came to a peak in these moments and have long-standing consequences to this day. So it was clear to us that looking back on those years would be very interesting and reflect on today's reality.
Thank you for that. I actually have so many questions about Golda's character. I do want to ask another meta question about the creating of this film and documentary. I'm sure you had a vast corpus. I mean, you probably have lots of footage and materials, and so how and again, I thought personally it was kind of perfect, the doses, but how did you came to decide who to interview? Because you definitely reflected on both sides, and you didn't. I felt it was very it was very wide. You didn't tilt to a certain direction, and so kind of how with decisions. I'm sure you had more than an hour and 20 minutes long of materials, and kind of if you can share a bit about the process. And I see we're getting some questions, and after maybe we'll go around to her character and some other points you raised in the film.
Absolutely. So I think the first thing, as I said, we chose to focus on her years in office. That cleared a lot of issues from the table because she had a very long career, foreign minister, labor minister. She had a big role in establishing the country in 48, but all of that was sort of pushed aside. And we addressed it a little bit in the film as background in certain moments, but we knew that the film really focuses on her premiership. And then the major, or the two first things that we wanted to choose the interviewees by were, one, people who can give us first witness accounts, so not experts or people who can talk about what they think, rather people who were actually in the room and can give us a first witness account of the events and of her behavior and decision making. This can be, of course, supporters, opponents, colleagues, family members. We have her grandson. We interviewed another one who didn't make it into the film. So it was a gallery of people who knew her and were in the room. That narrowed down the number of people we could interview greatly, because we're talking about 35 to 40 years ago at best, and people, most of our interviewees were over 80, some of them were over 90. Udi Nir already passed away since. So it was a small cutter to to choose from. And then the second thing that we tried to keep in mind was, as you said, having sort of both sides. And when we say both sides, in Golda's case, it doesn't even divide, and it's an interesting thing about her, it doesn't even divide into right and left, the way we're used to thinking about political right and left in Israel today. Golda was hated and loved by the right and the left. It's an interesting mix. But we did know that when you say the name Golda Meir in Israel, you get a very strong reaction. In most cases, I would say in Israel, it would be a negative reaction. In some cases, or in the minority of cases, it would be a very positive reaction. But it will almost always be a very negative one or a very positive one. Nobody's indifferent to her. And we really wanted to bring both these voices into the film. So we tried to balance it out as much as we could. And to name the main ones, I think for us, Udi Nir was definitely always one of her greatest opponents. He also comes, of course, from the political left, but he was one of her greatest opponents, basically the only major opposition when she was, for part of the time that she was prime minister, and always very outspoken about her. And on the other hand, we had Zvi Zamir, the former head of Mossad, who has been on a lifelong crusade, more or less, to clear her name, especially around the 1973 war, and in general, to always sort of advocate for her being one of the best prime ministers we ever had, with all the mistakes she made. So he's definitely one of our strongest supporters. And then in the middle, we had, as you can see in the film, we had Meron Mezzini, Professor Meron Mezzini, who is both, who is her spokesman, who is also her biographer, one of her biographers, and that didn't even make it into the film, but he even has a sort of family connection to her. His mother and Golda's mother went to school together in Milwaukee. And remained good friends throughout their lives. So, and he was for us a sort of balancing figure. I think he always has a lot of criticism about her, but also respects her greatly and knows sort of to balance the two sides.
So I would like to echo one thing you kind of mentioned, and also was here asked by Frida, and that's great. Keep on asking questions. We love it. At one point of the movie, it's her son or grandson that he says she was the queen of the Jewish people, and it kind of struck me because I guess it's really where you ask that question. If you ask it in Israel and if you ask it here in America, and I would say she comes from a generation. Probably viewers know, or maybe I'll briefly mention that her full name was Golda Meir, And on that generation, she was together with Ben Gurion, who was David Green, and also changed his name to Ben Gurion, and Shimon Peres, that was Shimon Presky. And she comes from this line of really great, admirable leaders. And I kind of wanted to ask you, was she the queen of, of the Jewish people, and was she, a leader of a generation, like those other names that I mentioned? And if you can kind of from your perspective share with us why she's perceived as she's in the United States and as she's in Israel. And thank you, Frida, for that question.
I think that, it's quite clear for me today why she's perceived so differently in Israel and especially in the United States. And I think it has to do with many things, but the two main ones would be, of course, the 1973 war, which, and I guess it varies, of course, and we can hear from the audience today, but as far as I got to speak with a lot of American Jews about this, I got the sense that the 1973 war was listed in the psyche as definitely not a defeat, maybe a sort of balanced war, and for some, I've even heard mentioning it as that they remember it was an Israeli victory. And I think the narrative is very different there for Israelis. Israelis regard the 1973 war as the biggest, almost only military loss of a war since the establishment of the state, and definitely the biggest one. And you have to keep in mind this is a trauma that pretty much every house in Israel who was there at the time experienced. Everybody knew someone who was either severely injured or died. So it's really a big collective trauma that really left its imprint on Israelis. That's one thing. I think that Americans are less, that Americans experience less, even if they are engaged with the Israeli story. And Israelis really experienced heavily, and that created the drift in how she's perceived. The other thing I would say is the Black Panthers movement. We can maybe touch on that more elaborately later, but briefly speaking, the topic of tensions between Ashkenazi Jews or Jews from Eastern Europe and Mizrahi Jews who came from the Arab countries in general. This tension that was always there from the establishment of the country, more or less, really culminated and came to a boiling point during her time. And again, from what from the experience I've had talking to Americans in the past year with this film, I got the sense that not a lot of Americans are aware of the Israeli Black Panthers movement, of these tensions and the way they erupted, and especially not how connected they were to Golda. And Golda really became the poster girl, no pun intended, but she really became the face of the Israeli Ashkenazi elite. That has a lot of, it's a complicated story, we can touch on it later, but that's how it was perceived in Israel. And I think these two issues really really created her negative image here, and we're not there to create this kind of image elsewhere. So I think these are the two main issues.
Yeah, that's actually make a lot of sense when you think about it like that. Because even, for me growing up in Israel, I don't know if we're the same year, but I'm in my 30s. I was born in the 80s of Israel, and in collective memory, Golda is definitely not more. She's not on the positive side, generally speaking, of leaders in Israel. And again, I think this movie really brings justice to the character. Not to say if she was, right or wrong, but more to kind of have a more round character and not just yeah.
Yeah, and I also add that there is definitely, for me, and working on this film in the past few years, it definitely changed the way I look at her. And part of that is also, you linked her with that generation, of Ben Gurion, and you can name the rest, Sharet and Eshkol, and all the first prime ministers, basically. Even Begin, who came after her, could be counted in that. I think all the way up to Rabin, more or less, we can count that generation. After that, when Bibi came to power, then it really started to shift. But all this generation, I think there's a sort of longing for this for the values of that generation of leaders in general, and Golda is definitely counted within that, even if she is not considered the best prime minister here, or considered the worst prime minister by some, but everybody would agree that her style of leadership, that her personal attributes, that her devotion to service rather than to her own good was admirable. And I always bring up an example that that to me was I don't know, eye-opening. When Golda once came back from the United States, actually to a visit to the United States, she wanted to bring. This was back when she was still a foreign. Secretary of State, so foreign minister, and she came back from the United States with a record player for her son, who was an aspiring musician. And when diplomats come back from abroad, they go through something called the diplomatic mail. They don't have to sort of go through customs. Their luggage goes through a different system. And only when she got home, she realized that her record player that she bought for her son actually didn't go through customs, although it should have. So she wrote a letter. We have this letter. She wrote a letter to the customs office in Ben Gurion Airport, back then Lod Airport, asking them to charge her the fee for the customs fee for the record player, but more than that, to fine her for paying it late and not on the spot when it arrived. And this kind of mindset, this kind of modesty, she lived throughout her life. She lived in a modest house. She never accumulated a big wealth. She would cook her own dinner, serve tea to her guests without any servants or aides. She was a very modest and idealistic woman, and that was her style of leadership. And I think in light of what we have today in Israel, but also elsewhere around the world, there is this, and certainly for someone who was born into this moment in time and didn't know really that generation of leaders, it was refreshing to see that there were once people who took their public office positions in such a manner, and it definitely opened my heart towards her a little bit, because I couldn't look at her anymore in the same, I would say, sort of cynical way that we are used to looking at our leaders today.
Yeah, definitely. So I would like to touch on 2 points you mentioned. One is the Yom Kippur War, and again, this is another question we got 2 side questions about, and we'll read into it as well. And the other one is the Black Panther, and the third topic, again, if time allows, is the Golda and kind of the feminist part, and we also have a question regarding women leaders. So maybe just to follow time, maybe we'll touch points around the Yom Kippur War, which I will mention 2 things. One, when Golda got to lead Israel was only 20 years old, right? And Golda herself was 21. And another thing is that you chose not to mainly deal around Yom Kippur, which would have been maybe an option, because it is kind of a tipping point in the history of Israel. And I will add to that, whatever you can share from that, is that one question was that in the US, we were told that the US advised Golda not to attack first in the Yom Kippur War. Is it true? Again, if you have any knowledge about it, did you deal with it at the movie? And the other one is, did Moshe Dayan, as her military advisor, take any responsibility for his bad judgment and losses of the Yom Kippur War? So feel free to kind of put this all together in whatever order you want to. And
I'll start from the end. Moshe Dayan, I think, never took any responsibility for any of his wrongdoings throughout his life. He's known for that. No, I mean, yeah, to start from that, I think the big tragedy with Golda and the 1973 war, especially in the way that it was perceived in public memory, in sort of collective memory in Israel, is that Golda was eventually blamed mainly for the weeks and days leading up to the war. with the big question, why didn't we start a preemptive attack? Why didn't the recruits of the reserve force start earlier? So these sort of strategic or tactical questions of the last moment before the war. And this is actually the moment where I, anyways, and I think a lot of people agree with me today, understand Golda the most, because Golda herself thought throughout the spring and summer of 1973 that the war will break out. We only mentioned it briefly in the film, but from May 1973, there was already one sort of period of waiting for war with a lot of reserves being recruited, mass amounts of money being spent on preparations, and then Sadat didn't attack. So there was this kind of, is there or is there not going to be a war question for a long time? And Golda, throughout this time, thought that we should be cautious and take into account that the war will come. In the weeks leading up to the war, Golda became even more convinced that a war will break. But you have to imagine the situation that she is in. She has a very strong intuition that a war is going to break out and that we need to move. But she's sitting in front of a cabinet of some of the most revered generals of the day, not only in Israel, but around the world. Names like Moshe Dayan were known back then, globally, as these sort of glorious victors of the 1967 war. And so it was very hard for a 70-plus-year-old woman with no military background, who is commanding the country and thus also the army, but still she didn't have any personal military background. It was very hard for her to sit in front of these huge generals who all unanimously, except for one, Tzvi Zamir, but he was sort of the head of Mossad. It's a slightly different position. She can't sit in front of all of them and tell them, you are all wrong and I'm right. And Zamir also told us that in the interview. He said, I came to Golda and told her I have very good intelligence that the war will break out in the next few days. And she told me, I understand you, I hear you, I believe you, but I cannot stand in front of 10 of the biggest generals around the world and tell them, you are all wrong, only me and Tzvi Zamir are right. So I definitely understand why it was hard or almost impossible for her to take a different decision on that topic. I do think that Golda could definitely be criticized for the road that led to the 1973 war, but I would say that the main issue there would be more in late 1970, early 1971, with the attempts of negotiations between Israel and Egypt. Again, a whole other topic. It's very hard to say always in retrospect if something could have been done or couldn't have been, but to me at least, it's very clear that Golda was not, she did not see peacemaking as an Israeli interest. She thought that we had, and she's not alone there. It's true for the entire Israeli leadership of the time. She was just a reflection of the mindset of Israel at the time, which was, we just won this huge war. We are very strong militarily. We cannot be beaten, and they will never sort of, even if a war breaks out, we will win it very quickly. That was the conception in those years. And so they did not think that it was their interest to really push for peace. And if you don't push for peace, then war will likely be your reality. So I think Golda can be criticized for that part of her decision-making that led up to the 1973 situation, but actually in the war itself, or the days before the war, I think she was the same voice. It was just very hard in the circumstances to make that voice heard. And also the second thing that really surprised me was reading, when we started working on the 1973 episode of the film, we started by watching, there's so many films that have been done on this war. We tried to watch as many of them as we could. And the most remarkable thing for us was that in almost all of them, Golda is a sort of minor character. You would hear the generals speaking, or you would see, the documentaries about the generals and the strategic decisions and how they move the tanks and everything. But Golda's role within this war was really minimized for a lot of years. And when we started to read into it and to talk to the interviewees, we saw that both from her, that was, I think, the only moment where both her supporters and her opponents, including even Udi Nir, had some warm words about her. Because what happens during the war is that all of these generals that I was speaking about before, all of these brave men suddenly start collapsing one by one. One disappears for a couple of days. The other talks about using nuclear weapons. The third one, they're all like going out the window, basically. And Golda is holding it together, literally. She spends all of her time in the office. She doesn't go home. She basically spends her days calming down all the generals one by one, trying to reassure them that everything will be fine and that they should, slow down and take a deep breath. And she goes down and meets the troops in the Sinai Desert. That's the segment in the film as well. She was a very, very positive figure during the war. In opposition to all of these men who said that the war will not even come. So I think there's a great injustice made to her character and to the historical story in the way Israelis remember her during the war. I think that's starting to change in recent years. The film might be a part of it now, but it's a trend that I think has already started. You'll have to remind me the question before the 1973 war. I forgot it by now.
Was with Moshe Sharet, but I think you did answer that.
With Moshe Dayan.
Moshe Dayan, sorry.
Yeah. So just to say, eventually what happened was that Golda resigned after the Agranat committee that investigated the war. Golda resigned, although there was no, the committee did not ask any of the leaders of the time to resign, but Golda did choose to take the personal responsibility. And she said, I head the government. It doesn't matter who's to blame. I'm definitely to blame. I headed the government. And she resigned. Moshe Dayan definitely did not do the same. He did offer Golda his resignation. She told him she wouldn't have it. She wants to resign herself. She was at the helm. But I think the fact that she went home quite disgracefully, and he went on to stay in politics for a good number of years, and for many, basically until the end of his life, was quite a positive figure. I think only in recent years his figure has started to crack, with a lot of stories about sexual harassment and about stealing antiques and about a whole bunch of stuff. But back then he was a very positive figure until the day he died, basically. So there's a great injustice there.
Yeah, he definitely became an icon in the Israeli culture, and even with his eye patch. And there was another thing. Do you have any knowledge if she was told by the United States to not attack? That's something that you know anything about it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's true. Kissinger and Golda had quite they had a lot of disagreements, but they also had a very fond relationship, I think. And she had a good relationship with Nixon as well. And she was in close contacts with the administration throughout that period leading up to the war and then when the war started. And Kissinger contacted her. Well, actually, I think it's she that contacted Kissinger when Israel got the final word that the war is indeed going to break out imminently, in the next couple of hours. They called up Kissinger. I think it was middle of the night in DC, and he said that the United States will back Israel, but in order for the United States to back Israel, Israel needs not to be the first one to attack. That was a hard decision for Golda to make because she knew that a certain preemptive attack could save some lives, some Israeli soldiers' lives. Although what today most opinions say that it wouldn't have made a huge difference, but some lives might have been saved. But Golda also knew that without the United States support, Israel doesn't really stand a big chance. Maybe in this war it could have, but not in the long term, and we really sort of depended on the support of the United States. And that proved itself very well. I have to say that eventually, about 20, if I'm not sure I have the dates right, but if I'm not mistaken, it's about 2 weeks into the war when the United States starts sending big Galaxy planes filled with ammunition and military supplies to supply the IDF. But at that point, the war has been determined more or less. Again, won, lost, that's a narrative question, but the two armies were already standing in the Sinai more or less in the same positions that they were when the war ended a couple of days later. So the war was basically determined, but the psychological aspect for Israelis of seeing, and we've spoken to a lot of people who mentioned this, of seeing these huge Galaxy planes landing over their heads every 5 minutes, when there was a general atmosphere that Israel is sort of on the brink of surviving or collapsing. Seeing that kind of aid coming from the air from Big Uncle Sam was a very, very big sort of psychological turnaround in the course of the war. So I think in the long term, that definitely was a good decision by Golda not to start this preemptive attack, but it was at the request of Henry Kissinger.
Wow, that's really fascinating, and it's those doors turning, and until this very day, Israel is very much relies on the United States approval in many of basically many of both strategic and military steps. So it's very interesting to see where it's kind of rooted from. And I think the Yom Kippur is it's kind of the war from the outside, but I think in a way Golda was also facing a war from the inside. Israel, again, a young country, the society in Israel, again, very young. It's basically an immigrant society, a huge immigration coming from North America, from other Arab countries. My last name is Ochayon. My family came in those years as well. And again, growing up, what I knew, again, is kind of as a sporadic Israeli Jew, that Golda said, "Hem lo nechmadim," they are not nice. That's what she was quoted saying about the Black Panthers, which again, I think it's a very interesting topic to kind of bring up today, because I'm not sure everybody are aware of the Israeli Black Panther movement that was for sure inspired by the American one, but kind of if you can elaborate around that area, I don't know, again, from watching so many hours of her, if you have any knowledge about her decision. I think it's easier to talk today about being multicultural, but back then the melting pot was kind of the ideology. You bring all of those Jews and you want to melt them together into one society, but into what society? I mean, who is the ideal that you want to melt it to? So if you can kind of share a bit around that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think for me, that's actually even more than the war, that's the greatest tragedy of Golda's premiership. For Golda personally, the way I see it, she saw it a different way, but because Golda, you have to keep in mind that Golda throughout her life was a super, super devoted socialist. Her values were Zionism first, socialism second, the rest comes later. And for her, if this place wasn't, I mean, when she established this place with the labor movement, with the historical labor movement, the Mapai Party, Ben Gurion, and so forth, for them, and especially for her, she was a sort of, she was the socialist mark within the Socialist Party. For her, and she says it also, if we build a state for Jews, but they don't have welfare and they don't have good health services and they can't go to school for free and all of these social services, then we've done nothing. That's how integral it was as part of her dream. And so she spent most of her political life working on this topic. When the rest of the Israeli leadership, with the establishment of the country, only wants to allocate funds to equipping the military, she's the one saying we have to spend on housing. She's the one saying we have to start the national security institution, which in these days with the corona pandemic, albeit it does a very problematic work in supporting the citizens, it is a very important part of our ability to survive in those rough times. And she sort of looked ahead to these moments and said, we have to do these things. And so she establishes the National Security Agency pretty much by herself with great opposition from the rest of the cabinet. So it was really her mission throughout her life, housing, professional training, and so on and so on. It's really, most of her life was spent on that. and she saw herself, of course, and she was also regarded by most Israelis as the sort of flag bearer for socialism and for welfare and for looking after the poor. And then she finds herself in 1971-2, when the Black Panther movement starts gaining power. She finds herself all of a sudden becoming sort of blamed as the sort of leader of the elite, detached institution. And you also have to keep in mind that Golda grew up poor, and Golda raised her children when she was very poor and sometimes couldn't afford to buy food for them. So this whole flip, I think she herself never realized it really. She never understood how she was given that position. And I think what happened there is, I mean, it has, of course, also to do with racism. There was institutional racism in Israel's first years. There still is to an extent, but back then it was way worse. And much more defined. When you read quotes by Ben Gurion or by Golda or by others of the time, sometimes these are things that are really hard to hear today. The way they talk about Mizrahi Jews, the way they see Mizrahi culture, and for them, in many ways, Arabs or the Arab culture was linked to the Arabs who were at the time and still are for them the enemy. And it was hard for them, I think, to regard that culture in a respectful way. And so there was a lot of racism there, but I think even more than racism, I would eventually pin it, because again, they were all racist to an extent. I wouldn't say that Golda was particularly racist, more than the others. She was actually also very involved in struggles in other places in the world against racism. She laid out the foundation for the relationship between Israel and most countries in Africa. She traveled to Africa a great deal of times, and there are some incidents where she actually stood up against discrimination in places that she went to in Africa. And so I don't think she was inherently racist, but the main issue, I think, was it was actually age, or the generational gap, rather than racism. I think that when Golda met the Black Panthers, for her, they were first newcomers. And in the way that she saw things, she was a newcomer once. And when she came in the 20s to live in back then Palestine, she was not given anything. She wasn't given housing. She wasn't given a job. She wasn't given education. She had to earn everything for herself. And the fact that they're now demanding to get these things when they just came a few years ago was for her mind-boggling. It was hard for her to understand how come they claimed such a place. Why are they not pioneers? And of course, when you look into the different stories, the way that the wave of immigration that arrived in Israel post 1948, after the state was established, and were brought by the Israeli establishment rather than just being refugees who are fleeing and coming into Israel. These waves were fundamentally different in what they expected, in the motivations that they had, and in the way that they got to the country. And so, of course, for them, it was a completely different story, and they demanded certain things, and for her, it was unperceivable. That's one thing. And I think the other was even a more purely sort of ageist thing, is that they're very, very young. These are a group of 20-something-year-olds sitting in front of the 70-plus-year-old prime minister, and she saw the way that they speak as a sort of great kind of disrespect and disregard for her position, for her career, for the fact that she's worked in public office with a great deal of determination and conviction for a lot of years. And they sort of disregarded all of that and spoke to her like she was their friend. And to her, that was a big insult. I have to say that when I for me, reading the protocol of the meeting was a remarkable moment. If I was talking before about the things that brought me closer to Golda, that was maybe one of the moments that pulled me away from Golda the strongest throughout working on this film, because it's really a train wreck of a meeting. I mean, it's 20 pages of a protocol, and with each page that goes on, you just, you go like, oh no, you did not say that. Like it's a very hard read. And I think the best marker for that, and we also addressed it in the film, was the fact that she keeps asking them, where do you work? Where does your father work? Where does your mother work? Why does your sister not work? And she's somehow completely unaware of their situation. Her Meron Medzini, her spokesman, also said in the film that he thinks that they didn't prepare her properly for this meeting. I think she didn't know well enough who she's sitting with. And it was really an explosion. I mean, again, asking someone what do you do for work is an okay question, but asking that, I think we counted it was over 30 times in a 2-hour meeting, when the circumstances of these people were that there were no jobs available. And she asks, why are you not going to school? Because there were no schools available. And so her questions somehow become insulting over time. They tell her again and again the reasons, and she keeps asking as if their questions are not good enough. So it's these kind of things. I think it's the tone in which she spoke with them that really brought the meeting down. The remarkable thing is that if Golda, I think that Golda and the Black Panthers could have agreed on more or less all of their demands. They came with a big list of demands.
Yeah.
All of these things would have been things that she would have approved for sure. It's her worldview that things should work out like that. But she failed to give them a seat at the table. She failed to give them the recognition that they should have gotten at that time, and she failed to realize that they have the street behind them, that they are a big, growing political movement rather than a couple of youngsters with no rules. These young anarchists. And so she really missed them there. And the great tragedy or the great irony about that story is that when Begin comes to power, not directly after Golda, but just after a few years, one of the first things that Begin does is to change the to change the rules basically of the National Security Institution, and to change other rules of welfare. And basically one of his first steps was to cut down on government funding for the poor, for the people who needed it the most. But he was able to capitalize on Golda's detachment, sort of personal detachment from the Black Panthers, and sort of use that sense of Golda being part of this old elite to gain his political power and to actually come to power. So it's a great irony, I think. In worldviews, they agreed on everything, but around the table, there was just a personal incompatibility that didn't pull through.
Wow, it's really fascinating, and it's kind of watching obviously in retrospective, but watching like a train go down, because basically, as you're saying, I mean, I feel like, again, from watching from the outside in time's view, but that they were telling the same story, but again, very very kind of typical. They were having more kind of a position at the table, and not like opinions and thoughts, and it kind of clashed. And yeah, again, it's a very interesting point that definitely led to one of the biggest milestone in the Israeli society, and the separation between in a way Sephardic and Ashkenaz. And I think that now in our generations, and I know that for me and for my kids, it's definitely all mixed, but it takes still a couple of decades to kind of recover and kind of put all those things together. And again, afterwards, the parting with Begin and the right movement, and like the more right wing parties, and again, ever since then, I think it's very much in what we see even in these days, in today's society. We're kind of we have a time for maybe one or two last questions. So if you have something, definitely add them on. I want to refer a question that was brought up, and I also wanted to ask. And the basic is: was Golda a feminist? And kind of, I am wondering, and would love to hear kind of your point of it. And also, you showed very nicely in the film that Ben Gurion said, she was the only man in the room, and as shown, she didn't appreciate it. So kind of, was she the only man in the room? Was she the only woman in the room? And someone here added a question that I would like to maybe put in this pile as well, that women leader, and thank you, Doug, for that, are often viewed through a more critical lens. And do you think, is this also the case because Golda was a woman? Was she or still harshly judged in the eyes of history and kind of society?
I'll start from the end again. An absolute yes. I think that the way that she is regarded in Israel has a lot to do with the fact that she was a woman. I think that if she were a man, there were still probably have been criticism of her, but not in the same way, not in the same tone. I think it's really easier for many Israelis to, or has been easier over the years, to disregard her because she was a woman. And I think it's part of why I think we still didn't have another female prime minister since. It's still an issue. And Golda also came to power in a very specific moment, I think, where the power of the religious parties was way smaller than it is today, which is another possible blockage to female prime ministers. But to come back to the beginning, Golda did not identify as a feminist, for sure. She rejected feminism as an idea. You have to keep in mind that for Golda, when we talk about feminism, for Golda, feminism was American feminism of the 50s and 60s. So it's a very specific wave of feminism that she detached herself from. But I know a great deal of other people, including feminist researchers and so on, will take the stand of defining Golda as a feminist. I call it a feminist out of circumstances. She did not take on the identity or she did not identify as a feminist, but she was where she was, and she was the first one in Israel and the second one around the world. And I think a lot of women at the time had to sort of conform to male norms, and many times to what's categorized as male behavior, in order to get to these positions of power for the first time. But I would definitely say that she was a feminist. That being said, she never promoted women. On the contrary, there was never a female cabinet of her, a female member of her cabinet. She never hired women for high positions. She was really, I think, feeling sort of comfortable alone at the top. Again, not unusual when we compared it to other female leaders of the time. It's a pattern that we can see in other places as well, but she definitely did not promote women. And I think her view on feminism was, again, even if we detach it from the definition of feminism of the time and so on, she saw the world in a very simple way. And she always said that in her world, anybody could do anything if they work hard enough and they put their mind to it. And the law obviously doesn't forbid them of doing that, which is important. But for her, once the law in Israel, for example, did not forbid women of holding positions of power, then women could hold positions of power. She did not think about securing the place of women in power or the challenges. She did deal with the challenges that women have to go through opposed to men when they want to hold positions of power. And I think that's also where it's the only places where she is sort of soft toward, in the way she writes, she's sort of soft towards the idea of feminism. The only place where that happens is when she speaks about her own conflicts being a working mom. That's where she always breaks a little bit, because I remember one good saying where she says, the life of any woman I know who is who is working outside the home is twice or three times harder than of any man holding the same position, because she has to be in this constant tension between the home and the house and the kids and the work. This is, of course, and for Golda was a conservative. For her, raising the children was absolutely her own job, or her sister's job when she was busy. But she would never, consider it sort of an equal issue. Raising the kids, that's the woman's job for her. So it's an old-fashioned kind of feminism, but I think she was a feminist. And the story that I always like sharing about this, just because I found it witty, as Golda sometimes knew how to be. She was a very funny woman. When you read through her autobiography, I laughed out loud. That surprised me when I read it. And there's a great story where she tells about her time in the kibbutz when she just arrived to Palestine in the 20s. She went to work in the kibbutz, and there was a big debate in the kibbutz assembly because the women were complaining that they are sent to do kitchen duty all the time, when the men were doing agricultural work, or farming work, feeding the animals and so on. And she famously said in one of the gatherings in the kibbutz that she doesn't understand why, for the women, why it is better or superior to feed the cows rather than to feed the men. So for her, I think it was a very simple and straightforward way of looking at things. She didn't want to sort of cling to the symbolics of out of the kitchen into the kitchen. For her, it didn't matter. As long as she could do whatever she wanted, if she put her mind to it, then that was proof for her that the situation is okay for women.
Thank you again. Very enlightening and funny. For our last kind of question, because we really have only 2 minutes, and it's a great opportunity, first of all, to thank you and everyone who are here with us for 2-3 more minutes. Is I would like to kind of get your point, and what would you think, or what do you think that Golda, if she was here with us today, what would she say about Israel today, think about Israel today, maybe even do, if she was here to see Israel going for a couple of more decades after?
Yeah, I think 2 things would probably trouble her the most. Or I would even say one more than anything. And it comes back to what I was talking about before. I think Golda had a very big devotion and sense of duty when taking into account her public work. And I think that for her, a certain degree of modesty and of setting an example in the way you live was very, very important. And she held on to that dearly throughout her career. And I think that if she would have seen, again, the style, without even addressing the political issues of right and left, or the approaches of how to solve Middle Eastern issues, or just the basics of what a leader is, what a prime minister is, how is he or she living, what is she or he accused of over the years. I mean, these issues would have probably enraged her, or just made her very, very sad. I think that's one issue that she would definitely react to. And the other one would probably be more or less the dissolvement of the Israeli welfare state, which started happening in the late 70s, early 80s, and is still basically going on to this day. Again, this was her political life's work, making sure that we all have certain minimal conditions to go by with. And I think if she would have seen how privatized the market is, how little support there is from the government for the citizens in the last few decades, she would have seen it as a big, big failure. And a while back, I was participating in another Q&A. I always used to give this answer. I felt always, maybe it's my opinion. It's always hard to say what Golda would have said. I've never actually met her, although I researched her quite a bit. But a while back, I had another Q&A, and Meron Mabzini, her spokesman, was participating, and he was asked the same question and gave the exact same answer. And once he did, I said, okay, then probably I got it right. I think that these two issues, the dissolvement of the Israeli welfare state and the lack of modesty or any kind of ideals in the leadership style today would have troubled her greatly.
Okay, yeah, definitely much to think of. I do want to thank everybody here today for joining us. It's definitely a piece of our joint kind of peoplehood and our joint Jewish story. And so, thank you everyone for joining, for watching the film, and I do want to thank you, the in person, and the rest of the creators for really, I do think history is in depth for you guys because you did shine a very bright light on a chapter that I felt I know a little about. Even I majored in history of of the Jewish history, and still I think it's a piece of a puzzle that we all are kind of missed and missing. And so thank you so much. It's definitely something that I'm sure we'll see more and more, and already we've seen with some other films, books, and TV shows that that becomes popular these days. And so, thank you so much, Udi.
Thank
And
you very
everyone.
much, and thank you for the great questions.
Yay! Thank you.